Montana Territory, 1875. The snow fell like judgment from a merciless sky. Yearning for shelter, young Tanner pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame and squinted into the howling whiteness. His stallion Maverick trudged forward with faltering steps, head bowed against the stinging ice crystals that had been falling steadily for the past 3 hours. Just a little further, boy, Young murmured, though in truth he had no idea where shelter might be found in this vast expanse of Montana wilderness. The nearest town was Eagle Creek, still a day's ride in good weather, and this was about as far from good weather as the young cowboy had ever experienced. At 26, Young had spent nearly half his life in the saddle, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. His face, handsome despite the exhaustion etched there, remained smooth with only a hint of light stubble along his strong jawline. Eyes the color of summer sky were now narrowed against the bitter cold, and his wheat-colored hair peeked out from beneath his snow-covered hat. Young wasn't afraid of dying, not exactly. A man who chose the cowboy life couldn't afford such fears, but there was something unutterably lonely about the prospect of freezing to death in this godforsaken wilderness, with only his horse for company and not a soul to remember him by. A man's meant to be alone out here, he reminded himself, repeating the words his father had drilled into him since boyhood. Attachments are just weights that drag you down. Keep moving, keep free, keep alive. That philosophy had served him well enough through 8 years of drifting. No wife to worry about, no children to feed, no heartache when the trail called him away. Just open country, honest work, and the simple camaraderie of fellow cowboys during the drives. If sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he felt a hollowness inside that the vastness of the Montana sky couldn't fill, well, that was just weakness talking. Another blast of wind nearly knocked him from the saddle. Maverick stumbled, regained his footing, then lurched forward with decreasing strength. Young knew with growing certainty that they wouldn't last another hour in this storm. The temperature was dropping rapidly as dusk approached, and his fingertips had already gone numb inside his worn leather gloves. Just as despair began to settle over him like another layer of snow, Young spotted something through the white haze, a faint, yellow glow. "A light, salvation. There, Maverick," he said, his voice cracking from the cold. "See it, someone's out here." He urged his horse toward the light, which gradually resolved itself into the outline of a small cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Young had never seen a more beautiful sight. As they drew closer, he could make out a sturdy log structure, a small barn to one side, and what appeared to be a corral buried under snowdrifts. It was a homestead, modest but well-built, the kind of place that spoke of permanence in a land that constantly tested human endurance. Young was nearly at the cabin door when Maverick's legs finally gave out. The exhausted animal collapsed into the snow with a soft groan, sending Young tumbling forward. He landed hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, as darkness crowded the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was the cabin door flying open and 2 small figures rushing toward him through the swirling snow. "Mama, Mama, there's a man out here and he's not moving." Young struggled to open his eyes, awareness returning in painful increments. He was indoors, wrapped in something warm, and the blessed heat of a fire seeped into his bones. For a moment he wondered if he died after all and this was some unexpected afterlife. "Hush now, Daniel. Our guest is waking up." The voice was female, low and melodic, with a gentleness that made Young think of summer breezes. He forced his eyes open fully, and found himself looking up at a young woman perhaps 23 years of age, with hair the color of ripened wheat falling in waves past her shoulders. Her dress was simple blue calico, worn but clean, and her eyes were the rich brown of fertile earth after rain. "Welcome back to the land of the living, cowboy," she said, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "You had us worried." Young attempted to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through his head. "My horse," he managed to croak. "Daniel and Emma helped me get him to the barn," the woman replied. "He's exhausted and half frozen, but he'll recover. I'm Nora Mackenzie, by the way." "Young Tanner," he responded automatically. "I'm mighty grateful, ma'am." 2 small faces appeared behind her, a boy of about 8 with his mother's wheat-blonde hair and a girl perhaps 6, with the same earth-brown eyes. They watched him with undisguised curiosity. "These are my children, Daniel and Emma," Nora said. "They spotted you from the window. If they hadn't," she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They all knew what would have happened if Young had remained in the storm. "Then I owe you my life," Young said, directing his words to the children. "That's a debt I take seriously." The boy, Daniel, straightened his shoulders importantly. "I helped Mama drag you inside. You're really heavy, mister." Despite his discomfort, Young felt a smile tug at his lips. I reckon I am at that. Are you a real cowboy? Emma asked, her eyes wide. With a gun and everything. Emma, her mother admonished gently, mind your manners. Yes, miss, I'm a cowboy, Young answered, though my gun's probably buried in the snow somewhere. We found it, Daniel said proudly. It's drying by the fire with your other things. Young took stock of his situation more fully then. He was lying on a narrow bed pushed against one wall of the cabin's main room. His clothes had been removed and he was wrapped in several thick quilts. The cabin itself was small but well ordered, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a table with 4 chairs in the center, and curtained areas that presumably led to other sleeping spaces. Everything spoke of care and modest means, a woman making the best of difficult circumstances. You shouldn't try to move yet, Nora said, noticing his restlessness. Your body needs time to warm properly. I've seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite by rushing their recovery. Yes, ma'am, Young replied, though staying still had never been his strong suit. I don't mean to impose. Nora laughed then, a sound as unexpected as birdsong in winter. Mr. Tanner, you're hardly imposing when we dragged you in ourselves. Besides, no one travels in weather like this. You'll be our guest until the storm passes, which likely won't be for several days according to the signs. Several days confined in a small cabin with a woman and her children. The prospect filled Young with an uneasiness he couldn't quite name. He was used to wide-open spaces, to the freedom of movement that defined his existence, and he certainly wasn't accustomed to the company of women and children. I should check on your horse, Nora said, rising from where she'd been sitting beside the bed. Children, mind our guest while I'm gone. Perhaps you could tell Mr. Tanner a story to help him rest. As she wrapped a heavy shawl around her shoulders and disappeared into the storm, Young found himself at the mercy of 2 intensely curious children who seemed to have no shortage of questions. Have you ever shot a bad man? Daniel asked immediately. Do you sleep under the stars every night? Emma added. Do you have a wife somewhere? How many cows have you seen at once? Can you teach me to ride a horse like cowboys do? The questions came rapid fire, and Young found himself answering as best he could, steering clear of the bloodier aspects of frontier life. No, he'd never shot a man, though he'd drawn his pistol a time or two. Yes, he often slept under the stars in good weather. No wife, no permanent home, more cows than he could count on the big drives. And yes, he supposed he could teach some basic riding skills when the weather improved. By the time Nora returned, stamping snow from her boots and bringing a blast of cold air with her, Young had found himself unexpectedly enjoying the children's company. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their worldview refreshingly uncomplicated. Your horse has been fed and watered, Nora reported, removing her shawl and hanging it to dry. He seems much recovered already. Strong animal. Maverick's gotten me through worse, Young said, though not much worse. Children, it's time to prepare for supper, Nora said. Daniel, bring in more firewood from the box on the porch. Emma, help me with the stew. Young watched as the small family moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. There was something mesmerizing about their interactions, the casual touches, the shared smiles, the unspoken understanding that flowed between them. It made him acutely aware of his solitary existence. May I help? He asked, again attempting to sit up. This time he managed it, though the room swam alarmingly for a moment. Nora glanced at him with surprise. Most men don't offer to help with cooking. My ma taught me early that everyone works on a homestead, Young replied, before she passed on, and I've done my share of camp cooking on the drives. A look of understanding passed over Nora's face. Well, if you're steady enough to stand, you're welcome to set the table. The dishes are in that cupboard there. Young moved carefully, his body still stiff and aching from the cold. As he placed plates and utensils on the simple wooden table, he found himself studying Nora surreptitiously. She moved with a grace that belied the obvious hardship of her life. No wedding ring adorned her finger, but she'd introduced herself as Mackenzie, not as Mrs. Anybody. A widow, then, left to raise 2 children alone in this wilderness. The thought stirred something protective in Young, a feeling he quickly suppressed. This woman had survived without him thus far. She needed his concern about as much as she needed another snowstorm. Supper was a simple but hearty affair, venison stew thick with potatoes and carrots, cornbread still warm from the oven, and preserved peaches for dessert. Young ate ravenously, realizing only then how hungry he'd been. This is the finest meal I've had in months, he said sincerely. Thank you, Mrs. Mackenzie. Just Nora, please, she replied. And you're welcome, it's nice to have someone appreciate my cooking. These two, she nodded toward her children with a smile, take it entirely for granted. Do not, Daniel protested through a mouthful of stew. Chew with your mouth closed, young man, Nora reminded him gently. As the meal progressed, Young learned more about his hosts. The Mackenzies had been on this homestead for nearly 4 years. Nora's husband, James, had brought them west from Pennsylvania with dreams of building a cattle ranch. 2 years ago, he'd been thrown from a horse while checking fence lines and broken his neck. Nora had been left with two small children, a half-developed ranch, and a mountain of challenges. Most women would have returned east, Young observed. Nora's chin lifted slightly. This is our home. James and I built it together, and his dreams are buried in this soil along with him. I won't abandon it. The fierceness in her tone impressed Young. He'd met hardened men with less determination than this slender young woman. How do you manage? He asked. The ranch, I mean. We've scaled back James's grand plans, she admitted. I keep a small herd, enough to sell a few head each year for necessities we can't produce ourselves. We have chickens, a good garden in summer, and I do some sewing for families in Eagle Creek. It's not always easy, but we get by. Young nodded thoughtfully. That's more than many can say, especially out here. After supper, when the dishes were washed and put away, Nora settled the children for bed behind one of the curtained areas. Young could hear her soft voice reading a story, the children occasionally interrupting with questions. The domesticity of the scene created a strange ache in his chest. When Nora emerged, she found Young standing by the window, watching the snow continue to fall in the darkness outside. It shows no sign of letting up, she said, moving to stand beside him. The winters here can be brutal. I've noticed, Young replied dryly. I was heading to Eagle Creek for winter work when the storm caught me. A friend said the sawmill there hires extra hands during the cold months. They do, Nora confirmed, though the work is dangerous and the pay barely worth the risk. Young shrugged. It's that or head south until spring. A cowboy without a drive is just another drifter. And is that what you are, Mr. Tanner, a drifter? The question, asked without judgment but with genuine curiosity, caught Young off guard. Most people didn't inquire about the nature of his existence, they simply accepted that men like him came and went with the seasons. I suppose I am, he admitted, never stayed in one place long enough to be anything else. Nora studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. That must be a lonely life. Young turned back to the window, uncomfortable with her perception. It's a free life, no one to answer to, no one to worry about, just me and the trail. And no one to miss you if the trail turns dangerous, she added softly. The words hit closer to home than Young cared to admit. Hadn't he had the same thought as he faced freezing to death in the blizzard, that no one would even know he was gone? Freedom has its price, he said finally. I accepted that long ago. Nora didn't press the point. Instead, she moved away from the window and began arranging blankets on a pallet near the fire. You should take the bed tonight, she said. You're still recovering. Young shook his head firmly. Not a chance, ma'am, I'll take the floor, I've slept on worse many a night. But, please, Young interrupted. My ma would haunt me from the grave if I took a lady's bed while she slept on the floor. A small smile touched Nora's lips. Very well, but only because I don't fancy being haunted by a Tanner woman I've never met. That night, lying on his pallet near the crackling fire, Young listened to the wind howling outside and contemplated the strange turn his journey had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been riding alone, answerable to no one, his future as open and undefined as the Montana sky. Now he found himself under the roof of a widow and her children, temporarily bound to this small cabin and the lives it contained. It should have chafed at him, this confinement. Instead, as sleep began to claim him, Young felt something close to contentment settle over him like a warm blanket. Perhaps it was simply gratitude for the shelter that had saved his life. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something he wasn't quite ready to name. The storm raged for 3 more days, during which time Young came to know the rhythms of the Mackenzie household intimately. Mornings began early, with Nora rising first to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast before waking the children. Young insisted on helping with the outdoor chores, breaking ice in the water trough, feeding the small herd of cattle huddled in the lee of the barn, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, and bringing in firewood. The enforced proximity should have been uncomfortable, but instead, Young found himself slipping into the family's routine with surprising ease. He spent hours teaching Daniel to whittle, showing him how to select the right piece of wood and hold the knife safely. With Emma, he constructed an elaborate fort of blankets and chairs in one corner of the cabin, much to Nora's amused tolerance. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, he and Nora would sit by the fire and talk in low voices. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her marriage to James at 19, the difficult journey west, and the challenges of the past 2 years. Young, normally reticent about his own history, found himself sharing stories of his youth in Texas, his decision to become a cowboy after his parents died, and the various cattle drives that had shaped his adult life. "Have you never thought of settling down?" Nora asked on the third night, her hands busy with mending as they talked. "Finding a piece of land to call your own." Young hesitated. The truth was, he had thought of it fleetingly in those quiet moments when the trail seemed too long and too empty. But the idea had always seemed distant and improbable, like a mirage on the horizon. "Cowboying is what I know," he said finally. "A man should stick to what he knows." Nora's needle flashed in the firelight as she considered his words. "My father was a bookkeeper his entire life," she said. "He knew numbers and ledgers better than he knew people. When he lost his position during a financial panic, he was lost himself, had no idea how to be anything else." "That's rough," Young commented, not entirely seeing her point. "It was," Nora agreed, "but then he took a position as a schoolteacher, something he'd never considered before, and he found he had a gift for it. He loved teaching in a way he'd never loved bookkeeping." She looked up from her mending, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Sometimes what we know isn't what we're meant for." Young pondered her words as he fed another log to the fire. "Maybe so," he allowed, "but it's a big step from knowing to doing." "Everything worthwhile is," Nora replied simply. On the morning of the fourth day, Young woke to silence. The wind had stopped its howling and a strange brightness filtered through the cabin windows. The storm had passed. He rose and dressed quietly, pulling on his now dry clothes and boots before stepping outside. The world had been transformed into a dazzling expanse of white, with snow drifted high against the cabin walls and outbuildings. The sky above was a clear, piercing blue, and the air held the sharp tang of extreme cold. Young made his way to the barn to check on Maverick. The horse nickered softly in greeting, seeming fully recovered from his ordeal. As Young rubbed the animal's velvety nose, he was struck by a peculiar reluctance to saddle him up and ride away. The logical part of his mind knew he should continue to Eagle Creek now that the weather had cleared. There was work waiting, and he'd imposed on the Mackenzies' hospitality long enough. Yet something kept him rooted in place, staring at the saddle hung neatly on the wall without reaching for it. "You're welcome to stay another day or two," Nora's voice came from behind him. "The trails will be nearly impassable for a while yet." Young turned to find her standing in the barn doorway, wrapped in her heavy shawl, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I've trespassed on your kindness long enough," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Nora stepped fully into the barn, closing the door against the cold. "It's not trespassing when you're invited. Besides, the children would be heartbroken if you left without saying goodbye, and they're still asleep." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it, yet Young seized upon it gratefully. "Well, I wouldn't want to disappoint them." A smile touched Nora's lips. "Of course not, that would be unconscionable." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. "I should see to the cattle," Nora said finally. "They'll be hungry after being storm-bound." "I'll help," Young offered immediately. The drifts looked deep. Together they trudged through the snow to where the small herd of cattle huddled together for warmth. Young noted with approval the sturdy windbreak James Mackenzie had constructed, which had undoubtedly helped the animals survive the blizzard. As they worked to break ice and distribute hay, Young found himself studying the ranch with new eyes, seeing not just its challenges but its potential. "You've done well here," he said as they finished the chores. "Keeping it going after your husband passed, many would have failed." Nora brushed snow from her skirts, her cheeks pink from exertion and cold. "There were times I nearly did. That first winter alone was," she paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the memory. "It tested everything in me." Young nodded, understanding completely. The frontier broke many people, men and women alike. Those who survived did so through a combination of grit, adaptability, and often plain luck. "But you made it through," he observed. "We did," she corrected him. "Daniel and Emma and I." Together, she looked around at the homestead, her gaze both proud and wistful. "It's not what James and I dreamed of, but it's ours, our home." The word home echoed in Young's mind as they returned to the cabin. Home had always been an abstract concept to him, something other people had, something he'd abandoned in favor of the open trail. Yet watching Nora with her children over breakfast, seeing the easy affection and shared purpose that bound them together, he found himself wondering if he'd been wrong about what freedom truly meant. In the end, Young stayed for 2 more days, helping to dig out paths between the buildings, repair minor damage from the storm, and replenish the depleted woodpile. Each task gave him a sense of satisfaction he rarely experienced in his normal wandering life. Each evening by the fire deepened his conversations with Nora, revealing layers of her strength, intelligence, and quiet humor that fascinated him. And the children, they were working their way into his heart with alarming efficiency. Daniel followed him everywhere, absorbing every bit of knowledge Young could share about horses, cattle, and survival on the frontier. Emma appointed herself his special assistant, her small face serious as she handed him tools or held items steady for repair. By the morning Young knew he must leave, the trails were clearing and there was no further excuse to delay. He felt torn in a way he'd never experienced before. The practical voice in his head reminded him that winter work at the sawmill awaited in Eagle Creek, that spring would bring new cattle drives, that the open range was his true element. But another voice, one he barely recognized as his own, whispered of possibilities he'd never seriously considered, of roots instead of wings, of building something that would last beyond the next sunrise. "You'll come back and visit us, won't you, Mr. Young?" Emma asked as he saddled Maverick in the early morning light. Her small face was solemn, her brown eyes, so like her mother's, wide with the importance of his answer. Young knelt to her level, his throat unexpectedly tight. "I'll try, Miss Emma, that's a promise." Daniel stood straighter, clearly fighting to appear manly and unconcerned. "If you come back in spring, you can help with the calving. And teach me more about tracking." "That sounds like a fine plan," Young agreed, giving the boy's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Nora stood a few paces back, her face composed but her eyes telling a different story. When Young approached her to say his farewell, she pressed a small package into his hands. "Some provisions for the trail," she explained, "and a letter of introduction to Mr. Peterson at the sawmill. He was a friend of James's. It might help you secure better wages." "Thank you," Young said, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "For everything, I would have died out there without your family's help." "Then I'm glad we were here," Nora replied simply. "The world would be poorer without young Tanner in it." There was nothing more to say that wouldn't complicate matters, so Young mounted Maverick and tipped his hat to the small family standing in the yard. As he rode away, he felt their eyes on his back and resisted the powerful urge to turn around for one last look. The trail to Eagle Creek was as difficult as Nora had predicted, with snow drifts that sometimes forced Young to dismount and lead Maverick through the deepest patches. But the sky remained clear, and by mid-afternoon he caught sight of smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. Eagle Creek was a town of modest aspirations, neither a booming success nor a failing enterprise. Its single street boasted the essentials: general store, livery stable, saloon, and the sawmill that was Young's destination. As he rode in, he noted a small church, a schoolhouse, and several dozen houses and cabins spreading outward from the main street. The sawmill stood at the edge of town, a large wooden structure beside a partially frozen creek. The sound of saws cutting through timber and the sharp scent of fresh sawdust filled the air as Young approached. He dismounted, tied Maverick to a hitching post, and headed for the small office attached to the main building. Inside, a burly man with a thick beard sat behind a desk covered in papers. He looked up as Young entered, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile. "Help you?" he asked gruffly. "Looking for work," Young replied. "I heard you take on extra hands in winter." The man, Peterson, Young presumed, gave him an assessing look. "Got experience with timber?" "Some," Young admitted. "I'm mainly a cowhand, but I've felled trees and split my share of wood." Peterson grunted. "Not much call for cowhands in January. Might have something for you loading the wagons. Pays $2 a day, sunrise to sunset, Sundays off unless there's a rush order." It wasn't great pay, but it would see Young through until spring. He reached into his pocket and produced Nora's letter. "Mrs. Mackenzie out at the Rocking M gave me this for you." Peterson's demeanor changed instantly at the mention of Nora's name. He took the letter and read it quickly, his expression softening. "You know Nora Mackenzie?" he asked, studying Young with new interest. "Got caught in the blizzard on my way here," Young explained. "She and her children took me in, probably saved my life." Peterson nodded thoughtfully. Nora's good people. She's had a rough go of it since James passed, but she's as fine a woman as you'll find in the territory." He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Any friend of hers is welcome here. I can offer you $250 a day and a place to bunk in the workers' quarters behind the mill." Young blinked at the unexpected improvement in terms. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Peterson." "James Mackenzie helped me establish this mill," Peterson said. "I owed him and now I owe his widow. Besides," he added with a shrewd look, "Nora says you're honest and hardworking and her judgment of character is better than most." And so Young found himself employed at the Eagle Creek sawmill, settling into a routine of hard physical labor that left his muscles aching but his mind curiously unsettled. The work itself was straightforward, loading cut timber onto wagons bound for building sites or onto the flatboats that would carry it downriver come spring thaw. The other workers were a mixed lot, some lifers in the timber industry, others seasonal laborers like himself. Young took his meals at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hargrove, whose cooking was substantial but lacked the warmth and care of Nora's simple dishes. In the evenings, he occasionally joined the other men at the saloon for a drink, but more often he retired to his sparse quarters to read one of the dog-eared novels another worker had lent him. Sundays, when the mill was silent, stretched long before him. On the first such day, Young rode Maverick out of town, telling himself he was merely exercising the horse. He found himself on the trail that led toward the Mackenzie ranch, though he stopped well short of actually arriving there. The second Sunday, he rode in the opposite direction, exploring the forested hillsides that supplied the mill with its timber. 3 weeks into his employment, Young was loading particularly heavy oak beams when Peterson approached him. "Tanner," the mill owner called, "got a moment?" Young set down his end of the beam and wiped sweat from his brow despite the January chill. "Yes, sir." "I'm sending a wagon out to the Rocking M tomorrow," Peterson said. "Nora ordered some lumber for repairs back in November before the snow set in. Finally got a break in the weather to deliver it." He paused, giving Young a measuring look. "Thought you might want to ride along, seeing as you know the place." Young's heart gave an unexpected lurch at the prospect of seeing the Mackenzies again. "I'd be obliged," he said, striving to keep his voice neutral. "If you can spare me from loading." Peterson waved a dismissive hand. "The loading can wait. Wagon leaves at first light. Driver's my nephew Billy, good kid but green. Having someone along who knows the route would ease my mind." That night Young found sleep elusive. He told himself his restlessness was simply anticipation of a break in routine, but he knew the truth was more complicated. The image of Nora standing in the yard as he rode away had haunted him these past weeks, along with Emma's solemn question and Daniel's pretense at manly disinterest. The Mackenzies had gotten under his skin in a way no one had managed in years, perhaps ever. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures cold enough to make breath steam but not so frigid as to make travel dangerous. Billy Peterson proved to be a talkative young man of perhaps 19, eager to share his knowledge of the territory and ask questions about Young's experiences as a cowboy. "Must be exciting," he commented as they left town, the wagon loaded with carefully stacked lumber. "Going wherever you please, answering to no one." Young considered the statement, which echoed his own long-held beliefs about his chosen lifestyle. "It has its moments," he allowed, "but there's something to be said for knowing where you'll lay your head at night, too." Billy looked surprised at this qualification. "I always figured cowboys were born restless. That's why you do it, isn't it?" "The freedom." "Partly," Young admitted, "but freedom's a funny thing. Sometimes what looks like freedom is just another kind of trap." The young man fell silent, clearly puzzling over this philosophical turn. Young himself was somewhat startled by his own words. When had he started questioning the values that had guided his adult life? He knew the answer, of course. It had begun in a snowbound cabin with a widow and her children, where he'd glimpsed a different kind of existence, one defined not by the absence of constraints but by the presence of connections. The journey to the Rocking M took most of the day, with the wagon moving considerably slower than a lone rider would have traveled. As they crested the final rise that would bring the ranch into view, Young felt his pulse quicken. The homestead looked much as he remembered it, though now free of the deep snow that had nearly buried it during his previous visit. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight line, and as they drew closer, Young could see a small figure running from the barn toward the house, Daniel, undoubtedly spotting their approach. By the time the wagon pulled into the yard, the entire Mackenzie family was waiting outside. Emma jumped up and down with excitement when she recognized Young, while Daniel maintained a more dignified posture that nevertheless couldn't disguise his pleasure. In Nora, Young's breath caught at the sight of her. She wore a simple brown dress with a cream-colored shawl draped around her shoulders, her wheat blonde hair pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. There was nothing elaborate about her appearance, yet something in the way she stood, confident in her own domain, struck him as unutterably beautiful. Mr. Young," Emma called as he climbed down from the wagon. "You came back." "I promised I would try, didn't I?" Young replied, catching the small girl as she launched herself at him. "And a cowboy keeps his promises." Daniel approached more sedately, but with equal enthusiasm. "Did you bring your rope? Can you show me how to throw it like you said?" Young ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "I brought it, and yes, we'll have a lesson before I leave, if your mother approves." His gaze moved to Nora then, and the smile she gave him contained a warmth that chased away the February chill. "Welcome back, Young," she said simply. "You're looking well." "As are you, Nora," he replied, suddenly aware of Billy watching this exchange with undisguised interest. Young made hasty introductions, and soon they were all involved in the business of unloading the lumber. Even the children helped, carrying the smaller pieces to the barn where Nora indicated they should be stored. As they worked, Nora explained her plans for the lumber, repairs to the barn roof, strengthening the corral fences, and building a new chicken coop before spring. "The old one won't last another season," she said as they placed the last boards in the barn. "And we lost 3 hens to a fox last fall because of the gaps in the walls." "Smart to get the materials now," Young commented. "Once spring comes, everyone will be wanting to build and repair." Nora nodded, brushing sawdust from her hands. "James always said to plan 1 season ahead. It's advice that served me well." When the unloading was complete, Billy announced that he needed to start back toward town if he wanted to make it a decent way before dark. He would camp along the trail and complete the journey in the morning. "You coming, Tanner?" he asked, clearly expecting an affirmative answer. Young hesitated, glancing at Nora. "I thought I might stay over and ride back tomorrow, if that's all right with Mrs. Mackenzie. I promised the children some rope lessons, and there are a few repairs around the place I noticed could use an extra hand." If Billy found this strange, he had the good sense not to comment. Nora's permission was readily given, and soon the young man was driving the empty wagon back toward Eagle Creek, leaving Young once again in the company of the Mackenzie family. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Young spent an hour teaching Daniel the basics of rope handling in the yard, with Emma watching in wide-eyed fascination. Then he turned his attention to the loose board on the porch step that had nearly tripped Nora earlier, replacing it with a solid new plank from the recently delivered lumber. By suppertime, Young had also repaired a leaky water barrel, fixed the latch on the root cellar door, and begun planning how to construct the new chicken coop when weather permitted. Watching him work, Nora felt a complex mixture of gratitude and something deeper she wasn't quite ready to name. That evening, after a supper reminiscent of the meals they'd shared during the blizzard, Daniel asked if Young would tell them a story about his cowboy adventures. "Please," Emma added, her expression making refusal impossible. Young settled into a chair by the fire, considering what tale might be appropriate for young ears. "Well," he began, "there was the time we were driving a herd through Wyoming territory and came across a grizzly bear." The children listened in rapt attention as Young described the encounter, which he judiciously edited to emphasize the bear's majesty rather than its danger. Nora, listening from where she sat mending a pair of Daniel's trousers, found herself as captivated as her children, not so much by the story itself as by the man telling it. There was a gentleness in Young that belied his rugged exterior, a thoughtfulness that suggested depths beyond the typical drifting cowhand. She had sensed it during his first stay with them, but seeing him now, relaxed and engaged with her children, the impression was even stronger. When the story concluded and the children were sent to prepare for bed, Young moved to help Nora clear away her mending basket. "You have a way with them," she observed. "Daniel talks of nothing but Mr. Young this and Mr. Young that since your visit, and Emma has taken to practicing her rope skills with a piece of clothesline." Young smiled, a hint of color touching his cheeks at the compliment. "They're good kids. You've done right by them, raising them out here on your own." "Not entirely on my own," Nora corrected him. "We have neighbors who help when they can, though the nearest is 5 miles away. And the town has been kind in its way." Still, Young persisted, "It can't be easy." Nora considered this, her hands automatically folding the mended clothes. No, it isn't easy. There are days I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake staying here, days when the work seems endless and the rewards few. She paused, her gaze drifting to the curtained alcove where her children were preparing for sleep. But then there are moments, watching Daniel master a difficult task, or hearing Emma laugh at some small discovery, when I know this is exactly where we're meant to be. Young nodded slowly. I can understand that. There's something about this place that feels, he trailed off, searching for the right word. Real, Nora suggested. Yes, he agreed, his blue eyes meeting hers. Real in a way few places do. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until Emma's voice called from behind the curtain. Mama, we're ready for prayers. Nora broke their gaze, gathering herself. Duty calls, she said softly. Make yourself comfortable, I won't be long. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Young stood alone in the main room, listening to the murmur of a mother's voice offering comfort and guidance to her children. The sound created an ache deep in his chest, not the sharp pain of loss but the duller throb of yearning for something he'd never truly had. When Nora returned, she found Young standing by the window, looking out at the starlit expanse of the ranch. He turned at her approach, his expression thoughtful. Penny for your thoughts, she said, moving to stand beside him. Young hesitated, then decided on honesty. I was thinking about paths not taken. Choices made and unmade. Heavy thoughts for a winter evening, Nora observed, though her tone was gentle rather than dismissive. Maybe so, Young agreed, but being here. It makes a man consider things differently. Nora studied him in the dim light, her heart beating a touch faster than normal. What things? Young turned fully toward her then, his face open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Whether the freedom of the trail is worth the price of having no place to call home, no people to call family. The words hung in the quiet cabin, freighted with meaning beyond their simple syllables. Nora felt a response rising within her, something honest and perhaps reckless, but caution held her back. This was dangerous territory for a widow with two dependent children. Those are questions only you can answer, she said finally. Young nodded, accepting her measured response. True enough, and I don't expect answers to come easily or quickly. They spoke of lighter matters after that, the spring planting Nora planned, the cattle market prospects, the latest news from Eagle Creek that Young had brought with him. Yet underneath their conversation ran a current of awareness, a sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. When it came time to retire for the night, Young again insisted on taking the pallet by the fire rather than displacing Nora from her bed. As he settled beneath the blankets, watching the play of firelight on the cabin ceiling, he felt more at peace than he could remember being in years. In the morning, Young rose early and slipped outside to complete the chores before the family awoke. The day promised to be clear but cold, ideal for the ride back to Eagle Creek. As he fed the livestock and broke the ice in the water troughs, he found himself mentally cataloging all the tasks that would need attention as spring approached: the corral fence that needed reinforcing, the garden area that should be expanded, the roof that required new shingles on its western edge. It was strange to think so proprietarily about a place that wasn't his, yet it felt natural somehow. The rocking M was working its way into his blood, becoming important to him in a way no place had been since his parents' small farm in Texas. When Young returned to the cabin, he found Nora already up and preparing breakfast. The children emerged soon after, bleary-eyed but excited to find their visitor still present. Will you stay all day? Emma asked hopefully as they ate. Young shook his head regretfully. I need to get back to Eagle Creek. I have work tomorrow at the mill. The disappointment on both children's faces tugged at his heart, but it was Nora's carefully neutral expression that affected him most deeply. I'll try to visit again before the month is out, he promised. Maybe stay a bit longer next time, help with some of those repairs we talked about. Daniel brightened immediately. Could you help us build the new chicken coop? I've been practicing with the hammer like you showed me. I'd like that, Young said sincerely. After breakfast, as Young prepared to depart, Nora pressed a package of food into his hands just as she had on his first leave-taking. This time, however, she also included a small cloth bag. Cookies, she explained when he raised a questioning eyebrow. Emma helped make them yesterday before we knew you were coming. She'll be heartbroken if you don't take some with you. Young accepted the gift with a smile. Thank you, they'll make the ride back considerably more pleasant. The goodbyes were easier this time, tempered by the promise of a return visit. Even so, Young felt a reluctance to mount up and ride away that went beyond simple enjoyment of the Mackenzies' company. As he turned Maverick toward the trail to Eagle Creek, Young glanced back to see all three Mackenzies standing in the yard watching him go. The sight lodged in his memory like a physical thing, a touchstone he would return to in the days ahead. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Young worked diligently at the sawmill Monday through Saturday, earning Peterson's approval and the respect of his fellow workers. Sundays, whenever weather permitted, he rode out to the Rocking M to help with repairs and spend time with the family that was increasingly occupying his thoughts. February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to appear in the Montana landscape. Snow retreated from south-facing slopes, creeks swelled with meltwater, and birds returned to fill the air with their songs. At the Rocking M, the new chicken coop took shape under Young's guidance, with Daniel serving as an eager if not always skilled assistant. On these visits, Young found himself drawn more and more into the life of the ranch. He discussed cattle prices with Nora, helped plan the spring garden, and even assisted in delivering a calf when one of the cows went into labor unexpectedly during his visit. The work was hard but satisfying in a way his drifting lifestyle had never been, and then there was Nora herself. Their conversations had deepened over the weeks, moving beyond practical matters to more personal revelations. Young found himself sharing memories he'd long kept private, his mother's quiet strength, his father's rough affection, the loneliness of the years after their deaths. In turn, Nora spoke of her fears for her children's future, her occasional doubts about her ability to maintain the ranch, and her determination to honor James's dream despite the challenges. They never spoke directly of the growing attraction between them, yet it was there in the lingering glances, the casual touches that sent electricity through Young's veins, the way Nora's smile seemed reserved just for him. Young knew he was treading dangerous ground. Nora was a widow with responsibilities, not some saloon girl to be dallied with and left behind, and he was still at heart a wanderer, wasn't he? The question troubled him increasingly as March progressed. The spring cattle drives would be forming soon, and normally Young would have already been making arrangements to join one. Peterson had hinted that he'd be welcome to stay on at the sawmill, but the pay was less than what a good cowhand could make on the drives. Yet the thought of leaving Montana, of leaving the Rocking M and the Mackenzies, created a hollow feeling in Young's chest that no promise of adventure could fill. It was Emma who brought matters to a head in the innocent way that only children can. On a Sunday visit in late March, as Young helped Nora prepare vegetables for the noon meal, the little girl looked up from where she was drawing at the table and asked, "Mr. Young, do you love my mama?" The knife in Young's hand slipped, nearly nicking his finger. Beside him, Nora went perfectly still. "Emma," she said, her voice strained, "that's not an appropriate question." But Emma, with a child's persistence, continued. "But Daniel said Mr. Young looks at you the way Papa used to, and that means love, doesn't it?" Young risked a glance at Nora, finding her cheeks flushed and her eyes fixed determinedly on the carrots she was slicing. Daniel, who had been whittling by the fire, suddenly became intensely interested in his piece of wood. "Your mother is right," Young said carefully. "That's a complicated question that grown-ups need to discuss privately." Emma considered this answer with a slight frown. "But if you did love Mama, would you stay here with us instead of going away all the time?" And there it was, the heart of the matter laid bare by a 6-year-old girl. Would he stay? Could he transform himself from a drifter into a man with roots and responsibilities? Was what he felt for Nora and for her children strong enough to overcome the restlessness that had driven him for so long? "Emma," Nora interrupted firmly, "that's enough questions for now. Please take your drawing things to your bed and give Mr. Young and me a moment to finish preparing the meal." The little girl sighed dramatically but complied, gathering her paper and pencils and disappearing behind the curtain. Daniel, taking the hint, muttered something about checking on the new calf and slipped outside. Left alone, Young and Nora worked in awkward silence for several minutes, the only sound the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. "I apologize for Emma," Nora said finally. "Children her age haven't learned the art of discretion." Young set down his knife and turned to face her. "There's no need to apologize," she asked an honest question. Nora kept her eyes on her task, but her hands had stilled. Children often see things adults try to hide, even from themselves. It was an opening, however small, and Young gathered his courage to step through it. "Is that what we've been doing, Nora? Hiding things from ourselves?" She looked up then, her brown eyes meeting his with a directness that took his breath away. "I don't know what you've been hiding, young Tanner, but I know what I've been afraid to admit." And what's that? He asked softly. Nora set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture that seemed to buy her time to gather her thoughts. That despite my best intentions, despite all the practical reasons against it, I've come to care for you in a way I didn't think possible after James died. The simple honesty of her admission struck Young like a physical blow. There was no artifice in Nora Mackenzie, no coyness or calculation, just the truth offered plainly and bravely. I care for you too, Young said, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of emotion behind them. More than I've ever cared for anyone. You and the children, you've become important to me in ways I never expected. Relief flickered across Nora's face, followed quickly by caution. Caring isn't always enough, Young. Not when lives and futures are at stake. She gestured around the cabin. This is my reality, a struggling ranch, two children who depend on me entirely and no guarantees of success. Its roots and responsibility and the same views every morning for years on end. Her gaze was steady, challenging. Can a man who spent his adult life drifting truly be content with that? It was the question Young had been asking himself for weeks, and he still wasn't certain of the answer. I don't know, he admitted. I want to believe I can. Being here with you and the children, it feels right in a way nothing else has. But I won't lie to you, Nora. The trail has been my home for a long time. Changing that won't happen overnight. Nora nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than disappointed. At least you're honest about it, that's something. She picked up her knife and resumed her work. The spring drives will be forming soon. I expect you'll be heading out with one of them. Young hesitated. Here was the crux of the matter, the first real test of his ability to change. I've been thinking about that, he said slowly. Peterson offered me a permanent position at the sawmill. The pay's less than I'd make on the drives, but it would mean staying in one place, near here. Hope flashed briefly in Nora's eyes before she schooled her features. And is that what you want? I think it might be, Young replied. If it meant I could see where we might lead. The tension in Nora's shoulders eased slightly. That seems like a reasonable compromise, a way to test the waters before diving in completely. Young nodded, relieved that she understood. I'd still want to help out here when I could. There's plenty that needs doing, and I've grown rather attached to your chicken coop project. A smile tugged at Nora's lips. The chicken coop would certainly miss your expertise. The moment of tension broken, they returned to preparing the meal, but something had shifted between them. An acknowledgement had been made, a possibility recognized. It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a promise of forever, but it was a beginning, a step away from the solitary path Young had walked for so long. That evening, as Young prepared to ride back to Eagle Creek, Nora walked with him to where Maverick was hitched outside the barn. The children had already said their goodbyes and returned to the cabin, leaving the adults a rare moment of privacy. I'll let Peterson know tomorrow that I'm accepting his offer, Young said as he checked Maverick's saddle. If it's still open. I'm glad, Nora replied simply. Young turned to face her, struck again by how beautiful she was in the fading light, her wheat blonde hair touched with gold by the setting sun. Without overthinking it, he reached out to take her hand in his. I've never been good with words, Nora, he said, but I want you to know that what I feel for you and the children, it's not something I take lightly. Whatever happens, whether I can change enough or not, I'll always be grateful for the way you've opened my eyes to possibilities I never considered before. Nora's fingers tightened around his. We're grateful too, Young. For the help you've given and for bringing something new into our lives. She smiled, a touch of mischief lightening her serious expression, even if Emma asks inappropriate questions. Young laughed softly. She's a truth-teller, that one. Like her mother. They stood for a moment longer, hands linked, the future uncertain but suddenly rich with potential. Then with a gentle squeeze, Nora released him. Until next Sunday, she asked. Young nodded, mounting Maverick with a lighter heart than he'd had in weeks. Until next Sunday. As he rode away, he didn't look back this time. There was no need. He knew exactly what he was leaving behind and, more importantly, what he would be returning to. True to his word, Young informed Peterson the next morning of his decision to accept the permanent position at the sawmill. The older man seemed unsurprised and perhaps even pleased, assigning Young to a crew responsible for selecting and felling the best timber, work that paid better than the loading he'd been doing and offered more responsibility. Young also secured lodgings in town, renting a small but clean room above the general store that offered more privacy than the workers' quarters. It wasn't much, a bed, a chest of drawers, a table, and a chair, but it was his own space, the first he'd had in years that wasn't a bunkhouse or a bedroll under the stars. As March gave way to April and the Montana landscape began to green with new life, Young fell into a rhythm that balanced his work at the sawmill with his growing involvement at the Rocking M. Sundays were spent entirely at the ranch, but he also rode out on Wednesday evenings when his shift ended early, sometimes staying overnight before returning to town for work the next morning. Together with Daniel and occasionally Peterson's nephew Billy, Young completed the new chicken coop, repaired the corral fences, and began preparations for spring planting. The work was satisfying in a way he'd never experienced during his cowboy years. There was something deeply gratifying about building things meant to last, about seeing immediate results from his labor. And then there was his evolving relationship with Nora. With his intentions made clear and her cautious acceptance of them, they began a courtship of sorts, restrained by propriety and the presence of the children, but undeniably moving toward something deeper. They took walks around the property in the lengthening evening light, their conversations ranging from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions about life and purpose. Occasionally, when the children were occupied elsewhere, Young would reach for Nora's hand or she for his, the simple contact carrying meaning beyond words. In town, Young's connection to the Mackenzie family did not go unnoticed. Eagle Creek was small enough that gossip traveled quickly, and his regular visits to the Rocking M soon became common knowledge. Most regarded it as a positive development, a widow and her children finding protection and support, a drifting cowboy finding purpose. But not all reactions were favorable. On a Saturday evening in late April, Young was in the general store purchasing supplies when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. "Seems awfully convenient, doesn't it?" a woman's voice said from the next aisle. A drifter suddenly deciding to settle down right when Nora Mackenzie is looking vulnerable. "That ranch of hers will be turning a profit once the herd increases, mark my words." "Now Hattie," another female voice responded, "that's uncharitable. By all accounts, young Tanner is a hard worker and good with those children. And Nora is not one to be taken advantage of." "Men like that don't change their ways," the first woman insisted. "Cowboys and drifters, they're all the same. They stay until the wind changes, then they're gone, leaving broken hearts behind. My sister married one, lasted all of 6 months before he was called back to the trail or some such nonsense." Young stood frozen, a sack of coffee beans in his hand, the words striking at his deepest insecurities. Wasn't that exactly what he feared himself, that despite his best intentions, the restlessness would return and he would hurt Nora and her children in the process? "Evening, Tanner," a gruff voice interrupted his thoughts. Young turned to find Peterson standing beside him, eyeing him shrewdly. "Don't let old Hattie Barnes get under your skin. She's been predicting disaster since the war ended, and she's been wrong more often than right." Young managed a nod, but the conversation had left its mark. As he paid for his supplies and headed back to his room, he couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had been planted. What if the gossiping woman was right? What if he was fooling himself about his capacity to change? The next morning, as Young rode out to the Rocking M for his usual Sunday visit, these doubts accompanied him like unwelcome traveling companions. The spring day was glorious, meadowlark singing from fence posts, new grass greening the rolling hills, and the distant mountains still snow-capped against a perfect blue sky. Yet his mood remained somber, his thoughts troubled. Nora noticed immediately when he arrived. As the children excitedly showed him the newly hatched chicks in the coop he'd helped build, she studied his face with concern. Later, when Daniel and Emma were occupied with feeding the chickens, she approached him where he stood by the corral, watching the cattle graze in the lower pasture. "Something's bothering you," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. Young considered deflecting but quickly abandoned the idea. Honesty had been the foundation of their relationship thus far, he wouldn't undermine it now. "I overheard some talk in town yesterday," he admitted, "about us, about me specifically, and whether a man with my background can really be trusted to stay put." Nora's expression showed no surprise. "Small towns run on gossip, Young, surely you know that." "I do," he agreed, "and normally I'd pay it no mind, but—" "But it touched a nerve," Nora finished for him. "Because you wonder the same thing yourself." Young looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. How did she understand him so well after such a relatively short acquaintance? "Yes," he acknowledged. "I want to be the man you and the children need. I believe I can be, but wanting and being are different things." Nora was quiet for a moment, her gaze following his to the cattle in the distance. Do you know what James said to me when he proposed? She asked finally. He said, I can't promise you an easy life, Nora, but I can promise you won't face its hardships alone. Not very romantic, perhaps, but honest. And in the end, that honesty meant more than any poetic declaration could have. She turned to face Young fully. I don't need promises of forever, Young. I just need to know that whatever decisions you make, you'll make them openly and with consideration for those who care about you. The future is uncertain for all of us. That's the nature of life out here. We can only do our best with the day in front of us. Her wisdom and practicality humbled him. Here he'd been, brooding over his internal struggles, while Nora faced the reality of their situation with clear-eyed acceptance. You're an extraordinary woman, Nora Mackenzie, Young said softly. A hint of color touched her cheeks. Hardly that, just a woman who's learned that dwelling on what might go wrong is a luxury the frontier doesn't afford. She laid a hand on his arm, her touch warm through the fabric of his shirt. Now are you going to help me plant those peas we've been talking about, or should I ask Daniel to do it? Just like that, the moment of doubt passed. Not resolved entirely, Young suspected that would take more time and proof, but put into proper perspective. He smiled, covering her hand with his own. I believe I was promised the honor of the pea planting, wouldn't want to disappoint. The remainder of the day passed pleasantly, with the entire family working together to prepare and plant the spring garden. Young showed Daniel and Emma how to measure the proper depth for different seeds, while Nora marked out neat rows with string and stakes. By late afternoon, they had a substantial plot planted with peas, carrots, beans, and potatoes, the staples that would help sustain the family through the next winter. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they sat together on the porch, tired but satisfied with their day's work. Emma had fallen asleep against Young's side, her small body trustingly relaxed. Daniel whittled nearby, occasionally looking up to ask Young's advice on a particularly tricky cut. Nora sat in her rocking chair, darning a sock with practiced movements. Looking around at this tableau of domestic tranquility, Young felt something settle in his soul. A recognition that this, perhaps, was what he'd been searching for all along without knowing it. Not just a place to belong, but people to belong with, a purpose beyond the next horizon. The gossiping woman in town had been wrong about one thing, he realized. It wasn't the ranch or any material advantage that drew him to the Mackenzies. It was this, the simple comfort of shared work and quiet companionship, the sense of being needed and valued for himself rather than just his skills with cattle or horses. Whether he could sustain this feeling through the inevitable challenges ahead remained to be seen. But in that moment, with the setting sun painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, young Tanner allowed himself to believe that he had found his true home at last. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in a blur of work, growth, and deepening connections. At the sawmill, Young's responsibilities increased as Peterson recognized his reliability and intelligence. In town, he gradually integrated into the community, attending the occasional social gathering and even joining a committee to organize repairs to the schoolhouse roof. But it was his time at the Rocking M that Young treasured most. As spring ripened toward summer, the ranch came alive with activity. Calves frolicked in the pastures, the garden sprouted promising rows of green, and the repaired chicken coop became home to a growing flock that provided eggs in abundance. Young now spent every weekend at the ranch, arriving Saturday evening after his shift and returning to town early Monday morning. The children had ceased to treat him as a visitor, instead regarding him as a fixture in their lives, someone to be relied upon for help with chores, lessons in frontier skills, and the occasional treat smuggled from town. Daniel in particular had attached himself to Young, following him like a shadow and absorbing every bit of knowledge the older man could impart. Young recognized in the boy the hunger for male guidance that had been missing since James Mackenzie's death, and he took the responsibility seriously. He taught Daniel not just practical skills like rope work and tracking, but also the principles his own father had instilled in him: honesty, hard work, respect for nature and for other people. Emma's attachment was less obvious but no less profound. She would slip her small hand into Young's when they walked to the barn together, or bring him wildflowers she had gathered, presenting them with solemn ceremony. When nightmares woke her, it was increasingly Young she sought for comfort if he was present, climbing into his lap by the fire as he told quiet stories until she drifted back to sleep. And Nora, their relationship had deepened in ways both subtle and significant. They still maintained propriety, especially in front of the children, but the connection between them was undeniable. They moved around each other with the comfortable awareness of people growing accustomed to sharing space and purpose. Their conversations ranged from the practical to the deeply personal, building a foundation of understanding and mutual respect that transcended mere attraction. By early June, it was clear to Young that what he felt for Nora had evolved from admiration and affection into something he could only call love. The realization didn't come as a thunderbolt, but rather as a quiet certainty that settled over him one evening as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed, discussing plans for increasing the cattle herd. Peterson mentioned that the Jenkins place might be for sale come fall, Young said, leaning forward in his chair. Their pasture land adjoins your north boundary, could be a good opportunity to expand. Nora considered this, her expression thoughtful in the fading light. It would be ideal, but I doubt I could manage the purchase price. We're doing better, but there's still precious little extra after necessities are covered. I've been saving most of my wages, Young offered. Not much use for money living above a general store. I could help with the down payment if you were amenable. Nora looked at him sharply. That's a significant offer, Young. Almost like I'm investing in the future of this place, he finished when she trailed off. Yes, I suppose it is. They were both quiet for a moment, the implications hanging in the air between them. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice carefully neutral. And what would you expect in return for such an investment? Young leaned back, studying the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Nothing you aren't willing to give freely, Nora. I care about this place because I care about the people who live here. That's all there is to it. She was silent for so long that Young began to worry he'd overstepped. Then very softly she said, I think perhaps we should discuss terms more specifically. Before any decisions are made. Young turned to look at her, trying to read her expression in the growing darkness. What terms did you have in mind? Nora set her mending aside and met his gaze directly. If you're considering investing in this ranch in our future, then I think we should be clear about what that future might look like for all of us. Young's heart quickened. I'm listening. The children have grown attached to you, Nora began. Dangerously so if your intentions don't include permanence, and she hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. I have developed feelings for you that go beyond friendship or gratitude. If those feelings aren't reciprocated in the same way, or if your vision of the future doesn't align with mine, then it would be better to know now before we go any further. It was the closest either of them had come to a declaration, and Young recognized the courage it had taken for Nora to speak so plainly. She was a widow with children to protect, a woman who had already endured the loss of one partner. Opening herself to the possibility of another loss was an act of tremendous bravery. Young stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Nora Mackenzie, he said, his voice low and fervent, I love you, I love Daniel and Emma, and I want nothing more than to build a life here with all of you if you'll have me. In the dim light, he could see tears gathering in her eyes. Are you certain, Young, truly certain? Because the children and we couldn't bear it if you changed your mind 6 months from now or a year or 5 years. We've had enough of loss. Young understood her fear. It mirrored his own doubts about his capacity for permanence. But in that moment, looking into her eyes, he knew with absolute clarity that some changes were irrevocable. He was not the same man who had nearly frozen to death in a Montana blizzard months ago. That man had been running from connection. This man was running toward it with every fiber of his being. I'm certain, he said firmly. I won't pretend I don't still have moments of doubt, not about my feelings for you, but about my worthiness of the gift you're offering. But I know that every day I spend with you and the children confirms what I suspected that first week in your home. That here with you is where I belong. Nora's hands tightened around his. Then I think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that we should consider making it official for the children's sake and for ours. Young's breath caught. Nora Mackenzie, are you proposing marriage to me? A small laugh escaped her, part nervousness and part genuine amusement. I believe I am, young Tanner, though if you prefer to do the asking in the traditional way, I wouldn't object. Young didn't hesitate. Still kneeling before her, still holding her hands, he said, Nora, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Of allowing me to be a father to your children and a partner to you in all things for as long as we both shall live? Nora's smile was luminous in the gathering darkness. Yes, she said simply, yes, I will. The kiss that followed was gentle and reverent, a sealing of promises and the beginning of a shared future. When they finally separated, Young rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired. "The children will be overjoyed," Nora murmured. "Especially Emma. She's been asking when you're going to be her papa since April." Young laughed softly. "That child doesn't miss much, does she?" "Neither of them do," Nora agreed. "They've known what was happening between us perhaps before we did ourselves." They remained on the porch for a time, making plans in the quiet of the Montana evening. They would marry in July, after the haying was done but before the busiest harvest season. Young would move permanently to the ranch, commuting to his job at the sawmill until they determined whether his full-time presence was needed on the Rocking M. They would approach the land purchase cautiously, waiting to see how the expanded cattle herd fared before committing to such a significant investment. As practical details were settled, Young felt a deep contentment wash over him. This was what had been missing in his years of wandering, not just a place to call home, but a purpose worthy of dedication, people worthy of commitment. The false belief that had driven him for so long, that attachment meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant pain, had finally been laid to rest. When Young rode back to town the next morning, it was with the knowledge that his days of returning to a rented room above the general store were numbered. Soon, very soon, his journey would end where it had almost ended in a blizzard months ago, at the Rocking M Ranch, with the family that had saved more than just his life. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Eagle Creek and the surrounding homesteads. Peterson was among the first to offer congratulations, clapping Young on the shoulder with genuine pleasure. "Knew you had more sense than most cowboys," the mill owner said gruffly. "Nora Mackenzie's a fine woman. Those children need a father and that ranch needs a strong back. Seems like a good match all around." Others were equally supportive. The minister who would perform the ceremony visited the ranch to discuss arrangements, clearly pleased to see Nora finding happiness again. Neighboring families sent notes of congratulation and offers of help with wedding preparations. Even Hattie Barnes, whose gossip had once troubled Young, approached him in the general store with a grudging acknowledgement. "Well, Mr. Tanner, it seems you're proving me wrong. I suppose even drifters can find their anchors eventually." Young accepted the backhanded compliment with good grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Barnes. Sometimes a man just needs to find the right harbor." The children's reaction, when Nora and Young sat them down to share the news, was everything they'd hoped for. Emma shrieked with delight and flung herself at Young, nearly knocking him off his chair with the force of her embrace. "I knew it. I knew you were going to be our papa," she exclaimed. "Daniel said so too, didn't you, Daniel?" Daniel, trying to maintain his 8-year-old dignity, nodded solemnly. But his eyes shone with a joy he couldn't quite suppress. "Does this mean you'll be living here all the time?" he asked Young, "not just weekends?" "That's exactly what it means," Young confirmed. "If that's all right with you." Daniel pretended to consider this seriously. "Well, I guess it's okay, as long as you teach me to shoot when I'm older like you promised." Young exchanged an amused glance with Nora. "When you're older and only with your mother's permission, that's the deal." The boy nodded, satisfied with this answer. Then, in a move that touched Young deeply, Daniel stepped forward and offered his hand like a man. "Welcome to the family, sir," he said formally. Young shook the small hand with equal seriousness, recognizing the moment for what it was, not just a child's gesture but a young man's acceptance of a new authority in his life. "Thank you, Daniel. I'll do my best to deserve that welcome." As the wedding date approached, preparations intensified. Nora sewed a new dress of pale blue cotton, simple but lovely. Young invested in a proper suit, his first, ordered from a catalog and altered by Nora to fit his tall frame. The children were equally outfitted with new clothes, their excitement growing as the day drew near. There were practical preparations as well. Young gradually moved his few possessions from town to the ranch, including the books he'd accumulated during his months in Eagle Creek. He and Daniel built additional shelves in the cabin to accommodate them, along with a larger table that could seat the family more comfortably. One significant task remained, telling the children about their father. While they knew James had died in an accident, they were young enough that memories were already fading, especially for Emma. Nora and Young agreed that before the wedding, they should ensure the children understood that Young wasn't replacing their father, but rather adding a new dimension to their family. On a warm evening in early July, after a day spent cutting hay in the lower meadow, they gathered the children for this important conversation. Sitting together on a blanket spread beneath the large cottonwood tree beside the cabin, Nora began by showing them the small portrait of James she kept in her bedroom. "Do you remember Papa?" she asked gently, watching as both children studied the image. Daniel nodded. "He was tall and he sang songs when he worked, and he taught me to ride Clover." His voice held the wistful uncertainty of memories that might be real or might be constructed from stories he'd been told. Emma frowned in concentration. "He gave me a doll for my birthday, and he had a scratchy face when he kissed me goodnight." Nora smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's right, your father loved you both very much. He would be so proud of how you've grown." Young, sitting quietly beside them, felt the weight of the moment, the bittersweet reality of building a new family in the shadow of loss. "The reason we're talking about your papa now," Nora continued, "is that we want you to understand something important. When I marry Mr. Young, he will become your stepfather. That means he will help raise you and care for you, just as your papa would have done if he were still here. But it doesn't mean we forget your papa or stop loving him." Daniel looked thoughtful. "So we'll have two papas. One in heaven and one here." "That's a good way to think about it," Young said, speaking for the first time. "I never had the privilege of meeting your father, but I know he must have been a fine man because he helped create this ranch and he left behind two wonderful children. I would never try to take his place in your hearts. I just hope to earn a place of my own." Emma, who had been listening intently, climbed into Young's lap with her customary directness. "But we can still call you Papa, right? Because that's what you'll be." Young glanced at Nora, seeking guidance. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her expression soft. "If that's what you want," Young told Emma, his voice rough with emotion, "I would be honored." Daniel, still processing the conversation, asked, "Will our last name change?" "Will I be Daniel Tanner now?" "Only if you wish it," Nora replied. "You were born Daniel Mackenzie, and that name connects you to your father. You have every right to keep it." The boy considered this seriously. I think Papa would understand if I wanted to be a Tanner, since we're going to be a family." Young felt his throat constrict at the simple trust in Daniel's statement. "We can talk about it more after the wedding," he said. "There's no rush to decide." As the conversation continued, with the children asking questions and sharing memories of their father, Young was struck by the resilience of these small humans who had endured such significant loss, yet remained open to new connections. It humbled him and strengthened his resolve to be worthy of the family he was joining. Later, after the children were asleep, Young and Nora sat on the porch steps in the gathering darkness. The day's work had been exhausting, but there was a contentment in their shared fatigue. "You handled that beautifully," Nora said, leaning slightly against Young's shoulder. "The conversation about James." Young shook his head. "I just followed your lead." "You're the one who found the right words." Still, not every man would be comfortable acknowledging his predecessor so openly. Some might feel threatened by a ghost. Young considered this. "James isn't a threat to me, Nora. He's part of who you are, part of Daniel and Emma. Denying his importance would be denying a piece of the people I love." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Besides, I owe him a debt. He built this place, loved you, gave those children life. I'm the beneficiary of all he created." Nora turned her face up to his, her expression visible in the moonlight. "Have I told you lately that you're an extraordinary man, young Tanner?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Not extraordinary. Just finally wise enough to recognize what matters." Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Montana sky an infinite blue canvas stretching above the rocking M. In deference to Nora's widowhood and the intimate nature of the occasion, they had planned a simple ceremony with only a handful of guests: Peterson and his wife, the minister and his family, two neighboring ranchers and their wives who had been friends to Nora after James's death. The ceremony itself would take place beneath the cottonwood tree where they had talked with the children about family and memory. Nora had decorated the area with wildflowers gathered by Emma and Daniel, their vibrant colors creating a natural altar space in the dappled shade. Young spent the morning in a state of quiet anticipation, helping Daniel with last-minute chores and trying not to get in the way as female neighbors assisted Nora with her preparations inside the cabin. By midday, guests had begun to arrive, their wagons and buggies forming a small semicircle in the yard. When the time came for the ceremony to begin, Young took his place beneath the cottonwood, wearing his new suit and feeling simultaneously strange and right in the formal attire. Daniel stood beside him, serious in his role as Young's supporter, while Emma waited impatiently with Peterson's wife for her cue to precede her mother down the improvised aisle. The small gathering fell silent as Emma appeared, walking carefully while scattering flower petals from a basket. She reached Young and Daniel, giving them a gap-toothed grin before taking her place opposite them. And then Nora was there, moving toward him through the dappled sunlight in her simple blue dress, wheat blonde hair arranged in soft waves beneath a crown of wildflowers. Young had thought her beautiful from the first moment he saw her, but now, seeing her approach as his bride, he was struck anew by the grace and strength that defined her. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Young, though he would later remember with perfect clarity the feel of Nora's hand in his, the clear, firm sound of her "I do," and the moment the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When he kissed her gently and with reverence, the small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Immediately afterward, Emma and Daniel rushed forward to embrace them both, transforming the moment from a union of two people into the creation of a family. As Young knelt to receive their hugs, he felt a sense of completion unlike anything he'd ever experienced, as though pieces of himself he hadn't known were missing had finally fallen into place. The celebration that followed was as warm and unpretentious as the couple themselves. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Nora and the neighboring women. There was roast beef and chicken, fresh bread and preserves, vegetables from the garden, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Peterson had insisted on making as her gift to the couple. As the afternoon progressed into evening, there was music from a fiddle played by one of the neighboring ranchers, and even some dancing in the cleared area near the barn. Young, who had never considered himself much of a dancer, nevertheless took his turn with Nora, moving somewhat awkwardly but with genuine pleasure in the simple act of holding his wife in his arms while their friends and children looked on approvingly. When the last guests had departed with final congratulations and good wishes, the new family stood together in the yard, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Well," Young said, his arm around Nora's waist, "I believe we've successfully created a scandal by frontier standards." Nora looked up at him questioningly. "A scandal?" Young nodded solemnly. "A drifting cowboy settling down, a widow remarrying, and two children gaining a new father all in one day. Positively scandalous." Nora laughed, the sound as bright and clear as the evening air. "When you put it that way, we're quite the talk of the territory." Daniel, who had been listening to this exchange with interest, said, "Does this mean I can call you Papa now?" "Officially." Young felt his heart expand with a love so profound it was almost painful. "If that's what you want, son, nothing would make me prouder." "Me too," Emma insisted, tugging at Young's hand. "I want to call you Papa too." Young scooped her up with his free arm, balancing her on his hip. "Then that's settled. From this day forward, I'm Papa to both of you." As they stood together in the gathering twilight, husband and wife, father and children, a family forged not by blood but by choice and circumstance, young Tanner reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a solitary rider facing death in a blizzard to a man surrounded by love and purpose, the transformation seemed both miraculous and inevitable. The false belief that had driven him for so long, that attachment meant vulnerability and that the only true freedom lay in isolation, had been thoroughly disproven. In its place was a new understanding, that the deepest freedom came not from the absence of bonds but from the presence of the right ones, freely chosen and tenderly maintained. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, young Tanner led his family back to the cabin that was now, truly and completely, his home. 5 years later, young Tanner stood on the porch of the expanded Rocking M Ranch house, watching as 3 children played in the yard below. Daniel, now 13 and sprouting upward with alarming speed, was demonstrating proper lasso technique to his siblings. Emma, 11 and growing more like her mother every day, observed with the air of someone humoring her older brother but secretly impressed. And 3-year-old James, named for the man who had first built the Rocking M, attempted to mimic his older brother's movements with a piece of clothesline fashioned into a miniature lariat. The scene filled Young with a contentment so profound it sometimes still caught him by surprise. In the years since his marriage to Nora, the Rocking M had prospered beyond their cautious hopes. They had indeed purchased the adjoining Jenkins property, expanding their grazing land and increasing their herd to a size that provided a comfortable living. The original cabin had been enlarged with additional rooms to accommodate their growing family, and a proper barn now stood where the original smaller structure had been. Young had continued working at the sawmill for 2 years after their marriage, using his wages to invest in the ranch's expansion. When it became clear that the rocking M required his full-time attention, Peterson had understood completely, even becoming a partner in a small way by purchasing some of the ranch's timber rights. The door opened behind Young and Nora stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. 5 years of marriage had only enhanced her beauty in Young's eyes, adding new dimensions of shared experience and understanding to the attraction that had first drawn him to her. "Supper will be ready soon," she said, moving to stand beside him. "What has you so contemplative out here?" Young slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, nodding toward their children. "Still amazes me sometimes, all of this, when I came so close to freezing to death in that blizzard." Nora leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Providence works in mysterious ways. Though I suspect Daniel and Emma would say they did the real work, spotting you from the window that day." Young laughed softly, and they'd be right as usual. Those two saved more than just my life that day. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Daniel corrected James's grip on the rope with the patience of a natural teacher. Emma had wandered to the garden, where she was checking the ripeness of the season's first tomatoes with a seriousness that mirrored her mother's approach to household management. "Letter came from Peterson today," Nora mentioned. "Says there's talk of the railroad coming through Eagle Creek next year. Could change things around here considerably." Young nodded thoughtfully. "Change is the nature of the frontier, I suppose. We adapt or we get left behind." He looked down at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Though I have to say, Mrs. Tanner, I've grown rather fond of some changes." Nora's answering smile was warm with shared memories and promises kept. "As have I, Mr. Tanner, as have I." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the same mountains that had nearly claimed Young's life that fateful winter day, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a drifting cowboy with no roots to a husband, father, and rancher deeply connected to the land and people around him, the transformation still seemed remarkable. Yet it had happened naturally, one choice at a time, one day flowing into the next. The restlessness that had driven him for so long had been replaced by a different kind of energy, the desire to build, to nurture, to see his family and his land flourish under his care. "Children," Nora called from beside him, "wash up for supper. Papa, will you check that the stock is secure for the night?" As his family moved in response to these familiar instructions, the children racing toward the pump by the kitchen door, Nora returning inside to finish meal preparations. Young Tanner took a moment to offer silent thanks for the blizzard that had nearly killed him, and for the children who had saved him, not knowing he would one day be their father. Some might call it luck or coincidence. Young preferred to think of it as finding his true trail at last, the one that had been waiting for him all along, leading not to distant horizons but to the very place where his journey had seemed to end. With a content smile, young Tanner headed toward the barn to complete his evening chores, certain in the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be.